Okay, good morning, good evening, good midday, whatever it may be. If you're watching the visuals, I'm sorry for this light in the back of my head. I'm going to try to cover it with my head over the duration of the episode. So we'll see how that goes. But today I am so excited because today is the first episode of our September series, which is Serial Killer September. So all September long, we're going to be diving into cases that won't just shock us because of body counts. They're going to shock us because of what they reveal about power, control, and obsession, and how ordinary people can cross into extraordinary darkness. So today we're going to be flying across to Britain, the UK. I don't actually feel like we've covered too many UK crimes, but this is one of Britain's most notorious true crime stories. This could send chills down the spine of anyone across the UK, even the world. So this case is the case of the Moors murders. So between 1963 and 1965, 5 children, Pauline Reade, John Kilbride, Keith Bennett, Lesley Ann Downey, and Edward Evans were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. And this was all done at the hands of 2 people that went by the name Brady and Hindley. The Moors murders went on to shatter the innocence of the nation. They weren't just murders. These were crimes that rewrote how Britain thought about child safety, about women in crime, and about the nature of evil itself. So tonight, or this morning, or this midday, whatever it may be for you, we're going to explore who they were, how they found each other, how their partnership turned into cruelty, and most importantly, who the victims were. Because behind every headline, behind every courtroom sketch, there is the story of the victims. And in this case, this is the story of children with lives, families, and futures that were stolen from them. So this is the beginning of Serial Killer September. And this is the story of the Moors murders. So to understand how the Moors murders even happened, we need to step back. Like we always do, we take a little rewind. We're going around the racetrack, as I like to say, but we're doing it in reverse right now. And we have to ask ourselves, who were Ian Brady and Myra Hindley before they became Britain's most hated couple? So Ian Brady was born in Glasgow in 1938. His childhood was marked by instability from the very beginning. His mother, a young waitress, struggled to raise him alone. His father wasn't in the picture at all. And by the time Ian was a toddler, his mother had actually sent him to live with foster parents in a working class neighborhood. Now, this neighborhood was called Pollock. I translated it in the UK, so I'm really hoping that I didn't butcher that too much. Otherwise, we may have found our first word throughout the episode in which tell butchers. There's always fucking one. There's always one. So life in post-war Glasgow was tough. Poverty and violence was within the streets. Families were barely scraping by. So Brady grew up relentless and quick-tempered. But he was also incredibly intelligent. Teachers noticed his sharp mind, but also his dark streak. He seemed to have trouble fitting in, trouble following rules, and as a teenager, he was already in and out of juvenile courts for petty crimes like housebreaking and theft. But what really set him apart was his fascination with violence and power. While other boys were reading comics, Brady was burying himself in philosophy and history. Now, I want to be clear because when I say history, I'm talking Nietzsche, Hitler, Sade, like all of those awful ones, not necessarily diving into any other history other than gruesome attacks of power. So he was studying books about cruelty, torture, and domination, not with disgust, but with actual interest and fascination and envy. I'm adding the envy on the end of that because I read things with interest, but not with envy. So I think we need to remember there's a fine line for us true crime lovers out there, right? And I like to always pull us apart from these people we discuss. Also, I forgot to say, if you're watching the visuals, I hope you like my smiley face pimple patch. I feel like it brings a real nice touch to the episode. We need a little bit of smiles throughout. We're going to need it. It's like almost like a nice warm hug, or, the first sip of coffee in the morning, or if you're a tea drinker, or if you're, down the matcha train, matcha. How do you guys pronounce it? That's how I pronounce it, but I'm not actually sure if it's correct because it's not my choice of drink. Anyway, as always, I've gone off on a tangent, like I do. So we're going to go back to what Ian was doing. So we just discussed that he was essentially studying these books of history with pure interest. So by the time he had moved to Manchester in the late 1950s, Brady wasn't just another young man looking for work. He was a brooding outsider, obsessed with ideas of control and superiority, carrying the seeds of something so much darker to come. Now, Myra Hindley was born in 1942 in Manchester, England. Her childhood was much different to Brady's, but equally as formative. Her father was a very tough man, a veteran of World War II who expected his daughter to fight her own battles. So when Myra came home crying after being bullied, her father repeatedly sent her back out with orders to hit the bully back or face punishment herself. That strict, sometimes harsh environment gave her so much resilience, but also a desperate need for approval. I feel like approval is the best way I can word that, because I feel like I genuinely, having experienced losing a parent young, I can understand that desperate need for approval or love or safety. So I get that she hasn't lost a parent young, but I know for me, I've always tried to level up. I don't ever want to disappoint my dad. My one surviving parent's so important to me that it kind of builds this resilience where you always have this strong sort of face. And I betcha that's exactly what Myra was like. By her teens, Myra was described as ordinary in some ways. Blonde hair, working class upbringing, Catholic school education. But some people who knew her said she stood out because of her loyalty. She was the kind of girl who would do anything to prove her devotion. Friends later recalled that she could be stubborn, yes, but also warm and funny when she felt safe. Now, this is a key point. When she felt safe, she let her walls down. She was a warm, funny, genuine person in the beginning. Obviously, this eventually brewed to something so much darker. But I think it's important to paint a picture of who these people were prior to their crimes. And I think in this case, this is a perfect example that you can come from a good upbringing, something on the outside that looks picture perfect to others, something that others would beg for, want, and it still isn't going to make you a good human being. It's not going to make you make the right decisions or lead you to the right people. I think that comes down to who we are as individuals and our resilience or our discipline to say, no, this is not what I want to be around. No, I actually can't be around this. And some would call that walls. Some would call that protection, peace, whatever you want to call it. That's your safety. That's your gut feeling that you run from things that don't feel right for you. And I think if we really want, some of us can lead into darkness, of course, but And obviously that's why we end up having stories to tell like this. But yeah, I don't really know where I was going with that. But yeah, I just love to go off on tangents, don't I? Anyway, that's my little tangent. So now we're actually going to get into how Brady and Myra met. So Brady was a clerk at the same company as Myra at the time. He was aloof, brooding, and intimidating to most people. But to Myra, he was absolutely magnetic. She watched him from a distance at first, fascinated by his intensity. He read heavy books on philosophy during his lunch breaks. He dressed sharply. He carried himself like he knew more than anyone else in the room. And for Myra, she had always longed for somebody to lead her, somebody to give her a sense of purpose. And Ian Brady was absolutely irresistible. By Christmas of 1961, Myra had confided in her diary that she was in love with him. Soon they had begun a relationship. But this wasn't really a normal romance. Brady had actually begun shaping her, introducing her to his obsessions, all of his Nazi propaganda, all of his sadomasochistic novels. What a tongue tie. Sorry, I'm not going to pit stop because I've obviously jibber-jabbered a lot, but goodness me. And then furthermore, books about torture and mass murder. So he actually gave her the book My Fight to read, and that is spelled MEINKIMPF. Pretty sure that's how it's pronounced. But I actually had to look this up, and I'm just going to give you guys a brief rundown of what this book is about. So basically, this is like a autobiographical and political manifesto of the Nazi Party leader, Hitler. And it basically just outlines detail of Hitler's political beliefs, his political ideology, and his future plans for Germany and the world. So this is a book for people that believed what Hitler did was right, need I say any more on that subject. I have not read the book myself. I have no plans on reading it. I can think of many, many other ways I would like to waste my time. Wasting my time reading trash like that is not one of them. I'd rather read another really bad book. I'd rather read the Twilight series again. You could actually catch me reading Lord of the Rings again, but Twilight, no. Hunger Games? Not sure. Anyway, now I'm going off on a proper tangent, but that's what he gave her to read. So that was this guy's mindset. That's where we're at. Now, he had told her about his fantasies of committing the perfect crime. And Myra was in a mindset where she followed, and she more than followed. She idolized him. Friends would later say that she had changed completely under his influence. Her style became darker. Her outlook was just harsher. She had bleached her hair, hardened her manner, and become an echo of Brady's worldview. So what begun as a love affair has quickly sparked into something else. A partnership in which devotion and cruelty have fused together. So we always do a little stop at the end, pump our tires, because I feel like we've been going really fast, spinning lots of laps, cutting lots of circles. And I think we like to stop and reflect, because this was just two partially ordinary people that were shaped by their past and ended up colliding in the wrong moment. So he was manipulative and hungry for power, and she was loyal, eager to please, and so fucking desperate to belong that she was willing to follow anybody. So when all of those forces are combined, what followed was one of the most disturbing murders that Britain has ever seen. Between July 1963 and October 1965, 5 children disappeared in Manchester. Now, their names were Pauline Reade, John Kilbride, Keith Bennett, Lesley Ann Downey, and Edward Evans. And for 2 years, the police searched. Families begged and the headlines speculated. but no one imagined what was behind their disappearance. No one could imagine that it was Brady and Myra. So we're going to walk through each victim as not quickly. I don't ever like to say quickly because I feel like that's insensitive and that's not good wording. But we're going to walk through each case in an informative and condensed manner. That's what we're going to do. So Pauline Reade was 16 years old. It was the summer of July 12th, 1963. So 16-year-old Pauline was on her way to a dance at the Gorton Lane Railways Workers' Club. She was super excited to attend. She'd picked out her best outfit, which was a pink and gold dress. She'd pulled out new high-heeled shoes and her friends were already there waiting. However, Pauline never arrived. So on her way, Pauline had encountered Myra Hindley. Hindley was in her van, blonde, smiling, and offering Pauline a lift. So to Pauline, it must have seemed totally harmless. Myra wasn't a stranger in the dark. She was a young woman only a few years older than Pauline herself. So simply, Pauline had accepted. However, Hindley didn't drive Pauline to the dance. Hindley drove her to the Saddleworth Moor, where Ian Brady was waiting. So from there, Pauline was sexually assaulted and murdered. Brady later went on to admit to slitting her throat. Her body was buried in a shallow grave on the moor. Her dress, shoes, and jewelry were hidden in the soil with her. Her family spent decades searching for her. They clung to hope, even as so many years passed. It wasn't until 1987, which was 24 years later, that they would discover her remains. For her mother and her siblings, that day was bittersweet. Closure, yes, but also a wound reopened after decades of silence. John Kilbride was only 12 years old, and this was just a few months later when tragedy struck. It was November 23, 1963. John Kilbride was one of 7 children, and he was part of a close-knit Manchester family. His parents described him as cheerful, helpful, and always willing to lend a helping hand. The evening of John's disappearance, he had gone to the Ashton Under Lane Market. He was collecting empty bottles. So he actually went down there to collect empty bottles because you could return them for a few pence each, and John was saving up. However, at the market, Brady and Hindley approached him. They offered him a ride home, plus a bottle of sherry if they would help him carry some packages. So to a boy of 12, it must have sounded like total kindness, maybe even exciting, and he got into the car. And again, instead of driving John to his location, which was home, they drove him to the moor. And from there, Brady went on to assault him and strangled him with a piece of string. And John's body was buried in another shallow grave right beside Pauline's. And again, for years, the family lived in absolute torment, wondering what happened to their son. And they didn't learn the truth until the 1980s, when Brady finally confessed. So Keith Bennett was 12 years old as well. And this was the following summer. It was June 16, 1964. So Keith Bennett was a 12-year-old, sweet, freckled-faced boy with glasses, known to be gentle and kind. That evening, he was on his way from his mother's house to his grandmother's. Just a half-a-mile walk, and he had done it countless times before. However, this walk, he never made it. Myra Hindley had stopped in her van and asked Keith for help. Now, the help that she had asked for was basically, would he carry some boxes for her onto the moor? Again, her presence disarmed him. A woman asking for help. This sort of felt safe and trustworthy, especially to a 12-year-old boy. So naturally, again, they've given a situation where they've provided trust and safety, and another child got into the van. And he was never seen again. And unfortunately, Keith's body was never, ever recovered. And his mother, Winnie Johnson, has spent her life fighting for answers. For decades, she has pleaded with Brady and Hindley to reveal where her son was buried. She wrote letters, begged them in interviews, even campaigned for renewed searches. And she died in 2012, still not knowing where her son lay. And that, to me, is always one of the most haunting parts of any case, but particularly this case, is that a mother who never got answers. She never got to even find out where her son was. Lesley Ann Downey was just 10 years old. Boxing Day, December 26, 1964, Lesley had gone to the local fairground with her friends. She was known to be a lively, sweet girl with dark hair and a big personality. At the fair, she was surrounded by rides, music, and laughter. However, Brady and Hindley found her. They coaxed her away, lured her back to their house. And what makes Lesley's story particularly and unbearably tragic is what Brady and Hindley left behind. This was a 16-minute tape recording her final moments. On that tape, Lesley can be heard crying, begging for her mother, and pleading with her captors. However, Brady and Myra didn't even flinch. They didn't waver. They tormented her and their voices were cold. Now, that tape would later be played in the courtroom. Police officers broke down listening to it. Jurors cried and reporters actually left the room. And Lesley's mother, Anne, was forced to listen. She said afterwards, "I see it every night before I go to sleep. My daughter's face, her voice, that's my life sentence." Lesley was killed the same night she was captured and buried on the moor. Her small body was uncovered during the police search in 1965. Edward Evans was 17 years old, and this was the final murder, which happened on October 6, 1965. Edward Evans was a shy, quiet boy who loved football. So that evening, Brady met him at the Manchester Central Railway Station and invited him back to his house. But this time, Brady had actually made a mistake. At the house, with Myra watching, Brady attacked Edward with an axe, and he actually bludgeoned him to death. But someone else was in the house, and this was Myra's brother-in-law, David Smith. Smith actually witnessed the entire murder, and he was horrified. He went home that night in shock, and the next morning he decided to go straight to the police. His testimony was what blew this case open. So we have 5 children: Pauline, John, Keith, Lesley, and Edward. Each of these kids had dreams. Some were so young that they hadn't even gotten to the point where they got to have 5 more dreams before they got to their final dream. Most of these children were young children. And even Edward being 17, he had an entire future in front of him. Pauline was 16, and I'm sure she had begun to think about college. Like, it always devastates me when you really break down the victims. And I think with serial killers, because you've got so many victims, it's hard to not walk away from these episodes with a heavy heart. So I apologize for being the one to give you the heavy heart. But it also is me just sharing the story, right? Like, I'm not the serial killer or serial killers in this story. So the question wasn't if Brady and Myra were the killers. It was how many and how the police would actually prove it. So if it was not for that one terrified witness, the Moor's murders may have never even come to light. So I really want to break down the night of Edward Evans' murder so that we can paint a proper picture. Like, I know we just spoke about it and it may seem like I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I just really want to, I love to paint a picture. I call this the test run. Well, not the test run, but like when you've been like going around the track really hard and you almost need like that breathe a couple laps where you're going fast but you're cruising. That's where we're at. And I just think we need to stop and break it down a bit more. So like I said, it was October 6, 1965. And Myra had invited her brother-in-law, David Smith, over to her house in Hattersley. Smith was actually 17 at the time and was married to Myra's younger sister. He honestly thought it would be an ordinary evening, but instead he walked into an absolute nightmare. So inside the house, Ian Brady introduced him to the young man named Edward Evans, a 17-year-old football fan that Brady had met at the Manchester Central Station. Now, at first, the mood appeared normal. There was drinks and conversation, but then out of nowhere, or seemingly nowhere, Brady swung an axe. And this axe immediately struck Evans directly in the head. Dave Smith just froze in shock as Brady continued his brutal attack. Myra just stood by, detached, as if this was just another routine. When the violence ended, Evans lay dead on the living room floor. Brady then ordered Smith to clean up the mess, but Smith couldn't do it. Terrified and absolutely sick to his stomach, he stumbled home. That night, he confessed everything to his wife, Maureen. And by dawn, he had then called the police. Now, this would be the decision that would ultimately change everything. So it was the early morning of October 7th, 1965, when officers from the Cheshire Constabulary, goodness me, another one, knocked on the door of 16 Wattlebrook Avenue. Now, this was a small, semi-detached council house, and this was where Ian and Myra lived. Inside this apartment, the air was heavy, and we know that the night before, 17-year-old Edward Evans had been murdered in that living room, and his body was actually hastily wrapped in a plastic sheet and thustled with cord, laying awkwardly in the spare room upstairs. Now, Brady had initially thought he had cleaned up, but he didn't. And when the police entered, Brady had tried to act as calm as he could. He lit a cigarette and tried to keep his voice steady, as if this was just a simple misunderstanding. But the officers immediately sensed that something was wrong. The house just felt tense, almost sort of staged. At this point, the officers pushed past Brady and begun their search. Upstairs, they opened the door to the spare room, and there it was, the unmistakable shape of a human body beneath a plastic sheet. The smell, the silence, and the horror was the confirmation that David Smith's story was true. Now, Edward Evans had been bludgeoned to death with an axe. His skull was fractured, and his life was frozen in a frenzy of violence. Now, Brady hadn't even tried to move the fucking body. So simply, he was arrested on the spot. And naturally, well, not naturally, sometimes they do, but Brady didn't resist. He gave in. And if we're going to give him any credit, we'll give him credit for that. Now, Myra was taken into custody too. At first, both were charged with only Evans' murder, but the police weren't actually satisfied. Something about this scene just felt unfinished. There were details that didn't seem to add up. So they began to search deeper. Now, within a locked suitcase hidden in the cupboard, they found something chilling, a set of photographs. Now, this is something that I don't feel like we've discussed a lot because we probably haven't really done many serial killer cases, but they always keep a souvenir. They always seem to. This is just a common denominator with serial killers is they've got to take something to remember their victim. It's like a fucking prize to them. Like if you guys have ever watched Law and Order SVU, which if you guys watch Law and Order SVU, we can so be friends. I trust you with my life. You will see that is such a common play in the serial killer episodes, and they base them on loosely on true stories, like they are loosely. And if you watch some of them, you can kind of pinpoint some to true crime if you're a bit of a true crime junkie, you know? So in these photographs, there were children that were naked and posed and terrified. Others were of Myra herself standing on the Saddleworth Moor with her dog by her side. So to anyone else, some of these were just snapshots. But to detectives, they look like a roadmap, a taunt, or a clue. And Saddleworth Moor was about to reveal its secrets. So when the police first flipped through the photographs found at Brady and Myra's home, most were really unsettling. Like I said, they were children posed and vulnerable. But one image in particular seemed strangely ordinary. Now, this showed Myra on Saddleworth Moor standing proudly with her dog, Puppet. Now, Puppet was like a white terrier. I never ever, just a note, because I love animals. If I have never mentioned that, you guys now know that. I love animals, and my dog Alfie is my life. He is currently sitting across from me snoring his head off. But we never like to blame the dogs. So we will mention Puppet, but we will never, ever bring Puppet into this. Puppet did not know that his parents were nasty people. So we love you, Puppet, and I hope Puppet's okay. I really do. Now, in this photograph of Myra and Puppet was the stretch of the bleak, wide-swept land of the moor. To most people, this would honestly look like nothing more than a snapshot of a woman that was just out for a walk. But to the investigators, they noticed something else. The ground beneath her in this photograph was uneven. A patch of earth that looked to have been disturbed, as though it had been dug up and covered again. And this appeared to be the clue that the investigators needed. Now, we're just going to take a quick moment, to, one, insert a clap, and two, we're clapping because what great investigation work. What fucking brilliant investigation work. I just have to add that in there. That's some really good shit right there. That's what already separates this one from some of the others. So this is when the search begins. The moor wasn't just a pretty backdrop. It was a vast, isolated, and eerily empty place. This was a place where the wind whipped so hard that you could barely hear yourself think. Where the land just rolled endlessly, one patch of heather blurring into the next. A place where you could bury so many secrets and no one would ever stumble across them. Or they wouldn't stumble across them for years. So in October 1965, the police began scouring the Moor property. Officers, detectives, and volunteers trudged through the grounds, digging in areas suggested by those photos. It was painstaking and miserable work. Can we just, for a second, put ourselves in the shoes of some of these people that we talk about in these cases that are out there searching? Like, I don't think we appreciate how miserable the work is. I don't think I've ever worded it like that before, but that is quite for me, yes, I think we can all relate to miserable work, but this is like a different level. And trying to put ourselves in those shoes, unless we've been there, is terrifying. And these people just kept going because those photographs really did feel like breadcrumbs. Brady and Myra had left evidence of their crimes in plain sight. So on October 16th of 1965, the days of searching, they finally found something. Now, this was the shallow grave of John Kilbride, who again was just 12 years old when his life was brutally taken. Now, his small body lay in a shallow grave. His clothes were rotting from the dampness, but his presence was undeniable. Now, that boy had gone to the market to collect empty bottles. This was innocent. This was a child trying to be a child. And unfortunately, when his body was located, this did confirm his family's worst nightmare. Now, this even had officers shaken. This was no longer speculation that it was just more than one victim. Brady and Myra weren't just killers. They were serial murderers who had used the moor as their personal burial ground. And the search, of course, didn't stop there. Days later, they would find the body of Lesley Ann Downey, who was just 10 years old. She was buried in another shallow grave, the same little girl whose voice had been captured on the tape, crying for her mother and begging for mercy. When her body was lifted from the earth, many of the officers broke down. Some had children the same age as Lesley. To see her there in the soil, knowing what she suffered, was absolutely unbearable. So at this point, the moor is becoming a cemetery. When all these discoveries took place, the moor changed forever. It wasn't just a wild, empty landscape anymore. This was a dumping ground. And eventually it would go on to be known as a cemetery. And I don't mean there's actually a cemetery. I mean, like, that's what people know it as locally, to my knowledge. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know for a long time, I believe it became a place of mourning. Reporters did swarm the site, of course, writing about the desolate beauty of the Saddleworth Moor and how that beauty held unimaginable horror. Families of those missing children stood by, hoping, dreading, and waiting to hear if their loved one was the next to be found. And even after the trial and the interrogations and the interviews, the moor never really gave up all of its secrets because one child was never recovered. Despite all the repeated searches and despite Brady's occasional confessions, Keith's grave remains have been hidden beneath the vast, lonely expanse. And again, like I said, his mother died in 2012 with no answers. So we're going to go back, but we're sort of going forward, if that makes sense. We're going to expand on the tape a little bit more. We're going to expand on Lesley and Downey's tape. Now, if there was one piece of evidence that revealed the true depths of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley's cruelty, it was this tape. So among Brady's belongings and in their searches, investigators discovered a reel-to-reel audio recording. Now, this audio recording was 16 minutes long. Now, on it was the voice of 10-year-old Lesley Ann Downey. It began with crying, and I don't mean the kind of crying that can be soothed. This was raw, panic sobs of a child who knew she was in pure danger. You can hear her in the tape begging over and over again, saying things like, "Please, I just want to see my mummy." My God, that hurt me so bad to say. My heart is breaking. In the tape, you can actually hear Ian Brady's voice cut in, and he is cold and sharp and commanding. There is no warmth, no hesitation, no love, no anything in his voice. Not that a man like this can even hold any fucking love anyway. What a rich thing to think, Tal. Go straight to love. Like, he just doesn't even have empathy. He is a sociopath. Now he barks orders at her, forcing her to undress and demanding obedience. It just sounds like complete mechanical cruelty of somebody that absolutely loves and thrives in control. Like, I think this is the only level of love this man has ever felt. Apart from potentially Myra, like, I think the love they felt for each other was different, but I also feel like he pushed Myra around to make her exactly what he wanted her to be. And speaking of Myra, in the tape, you can hear her voice. She is calm and she's almost mocking. She's playing the role of the captor. She speaks to Lesley as though she is scolding her, telling her to be quiet and dismissing her pleas. For many, this is the moment that made Myra unimaginable. and potentially made her the most hated woman in Britain. It was clear to everybody now that she wasn't just complacent. She was active. She was a woman and a caretaker figure deliberately participating in a child's torment. And in this case, it was 16 minutes of torment that we know about. So months later, in April of 1966, that tape was played in open court. And again, I love to paint a picture, imagine the scene. Now, the courtroom was actually at Chester Assizes. I had no idea what this was. Is this just a court, a place, a something? If you're on the visuals, you'll see. But there you go. Essentially, that courtroom is filled with journalists that are scribbling. We've got family members holding hands and waiting for their justice. Police officers standing at the back, and then the crackle of this reel-to-reel machine as the tape begins. The sound of Lesley's small, broken voice filled the room, pleading, sobbing, and begging for her mother. This was almost unbearable for the courtroom to deal with. At this point, the jurors sat frozen and pale, and some were just wiping away tears. Reporters lowered their voices, their pens, unable to write. And we've got hardened police officers, hardened men that are sobbing openly, loudly. And these are some of the men that had to pull the bodies from the moors themselves. Some left the courtroom altogether, unable to listen to the 16 minutes in full. And inside that gallery was Lesley's mother, Anne Downey. She was forced to sit there and listen to this tape. She was forced to hear her daughter's final moments, her cries for help, her desperate need for her mother. Now, the line that Anne Downey said that we spoke about earlier about this being her life sentence, that really, really haunts me. Like, whoa. I think we just need to take a second. We're just going to do a little bit of breathing. Alfie must sense that we need some emotional support right now as we're getting to the end of this episode, because holy shit, is that not a lot to wrap your head around? Is that not a lot to grasp? There is so much evil and pain and torment and just pure absurdity that I just cannot wrap my head around. That we as a society of, normal, I don't want to just put it down to normal because I wouldn't even call myself normal, but non-sociopathic people, it's so hard to hear and speak about and just whoa. Anyway, we need to continue on because we didn't come this far just to come this far. So let's hope that these guys get their punishment. Let's ride this to the end. So that tape that was played, that wasn't just evidence. It was a window into what was really going on and a window into the Moors murders themselves. It proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Lesley hadn't just been murdered. She had been tortured. She had been tortured, degraded, and tormented in her final hours. And it essentially destroyed any lingering illusion that Myra could have just been a passive accomplice throughout this. Her voice throughout this tape was calm and complacent. It absolutely shattered her later claims about being manipulated and helpless. This tape went on to transform the trial. It cemented the public's view of Myra and basically branded her as the most hated woman in Britain. It ensured that the names Brady and Myra would never fade. 16 minutes. What can you do in 16 minutes? Think about that for a second. Like, I can do a bit in 16 minutes, but in reality, 16 minutes is a lot or not a lot, because that was all it was. And this 16 minutes has been deep enough to echoed for the last, I don't even know how many decades, but decades. It was enough to ruin the lives of absolutely everybody who loved Lesley. And it was enough to scar Britain's collective memory forever. And I don't even want to just put it down to Britain, the world. So throughout the trial, Ian Brady looked detached and even smug. He wore glasses and his dark hair was slicked back. His demeanor, he was trying to appear to be what I would describe as intellectual. He almost gave off this vibe that the entire trial was beneath him. He took notes and he whispered to his lawyers, and he even occasionally smirked, as if he was amused by the entire spectacle. Now, Myra, by contrast, sat with her platinum blonde hair. Now, she generally sort of put this into a bouffant, as I call it, bouffant style. The puff, the lepouf, and her expressions were cold and controlled. Too many observers said that she seemed almost proud, as though she understood and liked the attention that she was getting. Reporters went on to describe her as stone-faced and unflinching. It was this image, her cold beauty and her absolute lack of emotion, that would burn itself into the public's memory forever. So we obviously spoke about the tape in depth, but the prosecution's case was pretty overwhelming because alongside that, they also had the photographs, which was Myra standing on Saddleworth Moor with her dog by her side on that disturbed earth, which ended up being the graves of some of these children. And then David Smith got up and provided testimony. Now, this was the young man who actually witnessed Edward Evans' murder. Like we discussed, David Smith was Myra's brother-in-law at the time, and he was only 17 years old. I'm not too sure. He may have been 18 at the time of his testimony, but at the time that he witnessed this, he was a young boy himself. He went on in his testimony to describe in detail the moment that Brady swung the axe, the blood, and the horror that he witnessed. His evidence was critical and crucial. And finally, there were the bodies. The remains of John Kilbride and Lesley Ann Downey exhumed from the moors, confirming the family's worst fears. So at this point, the case against Brady and Myra was airtight, totally airtight. So on May 6 of 1966, after a 14-day trial, the jury returned their verdicts. Ian Brady was convicted on the murders of Edward Evans, John Kilbride, and Lesley Ann Downey. Myra Hindley was convicted of the murders of Lesley Ann Downey and Edward Evans. And additionally, she was also charged with harboring Brady after the disappearance of Pauline Reade. Both Myra and Ian were sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, the judge on this case was Mr. Justice Felton Atkinson, and he made it clear that there was no possibility of release for these two parties. He called their crimes truly horrible and unimaginable beyond belief. For Britain, the trial was more than just a conviction. It was a cultural moment. The photographs of Myra in the dock became iconic. They got splashed across front pages. Cold beauty, her blank expression, they became a symbol of pure evil. So for many, they couldn't seem to understand Myra's infatuation with Brady. But one thing that everyone made clear was that he was a sadistic killer. Yes, Ian Brady was an awful, awful man. But she was a woman who aided in the torture and murder of children. And that betrayal of motherhood is why she was labeled one of the most hated women across Britain. Women and mothers, future mothers, trying to be mothers, all mothers, cool aunts for life, all people. Even if you don't like children, people just can't fathom this level. And I think, and this is where you may hate me for saying it. Sometimes it's easy for people to wrap their heads around a man being the villain, right? But when a woman is involved in harboring and being more than an accomplice in, it just becomes this level of what anyway. That's my piece there. So that was it. The case of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley was officially closed and they were locked away for life. But for the families and for Britain, those scars would never heal because the Moors murders weren't just crimes. They were a complete rupture into the nation's innocence. A reminder that evil can wear an ordinary face. It can sit quietly in a courtroom and still be capable of unthinkable cruelty. And to be honest, the truth, the Moors murders never really ended. For Britain, this case was a breaking point. The 1960s had been a decade of change, freedom, youth culture, and optimism. Children played freely in the streets, hitchhiking wasn't unusual, and parents could trust their neighbours. They trusted that their neighbourhoods were safe. And then the Moors murders shattered this illusion. Suddenly, the faces of Pauline, John, Keith, Lesley, and Edward were all over the front pages. Families everywhere saw their own children in those photos. The innocence of childhood, walking to the market, heading to a dance, visiting grandma, all of those things were ripped away and they no longer felt safe. The moors themselves, once just another stretch of wild English countryside, became synonymous with death, a place people whispered about, a landscape that would now be forever haunted. So for decades, Myra has tried to change the narrative. She became Catholic in prison, wrote letters of remorse, and insisted that she had been manipulated by Brady, that she was simply as much a victim as anybody else. But the public never forgave her. Politicians called her irredeemable. Every time her case would come up for parole, protests just erupted. And eventually she ended up dying in prison in 2002. I hate to say it, but many in Britain at this time openly celebrated. And do I actually hate to say it? No, I don't. They openly celebrated. That's what they did. Fuck you. Fuck you, Myra. And Brady, meanwhile, remains unrepentant. He called the murders recreational. He absolutely thrives in the idea of being seen as evil. By the late 1980s, he was diagnosed as a sociopath and transferred to Ashworth. This is a high facility psychiatric hospital in Britain, I believe. Sorry if you're watching the visuals. I've got a little back spasm going on. And he actually spent decades here, refusing food, writing manifestos, and occasionally granting interviews where he just showed no remorse. And he went on to die in 2017. And it was the end of his life, but not the end of his shadow. So while the world has obsessed over Brady and Myra and even carried on all of the victims' legacies in their own way, it was truly the families who carried the real legacy. For the Reades, for the Kilbrides, for the Downeys, and for the Evans family. Their grief has been lifelong. These parents have never truly recovered. Siblings have carried trauma into adulthood. And for Keith Bennett's family, it's that extra length of hard because they never recovered his body. They never really got the answers they deserved. And like I said, for decades, she wrote Brady. She begged him to reveal where Keith was buried. She gave interviews, she campaigned, she pleaded with police. In the 1980s, Brady finally admitted to killing Keith. However, he never gave up the location in where Keith's body is buried. So time and time again, he tortured Winnie, Keith's mother, with half-truth and vague directions. And search teams combed the Saddleworth Moors for years, but Keith's body has still never been located. Now, Winnie was 78 when she died in 2012. Her final wish was to give her son a proper burial, one that she never got to fulfill. Now, that wish was just completely denied and declined and tormented on by Brady. because I think from prison, that was how he could still have control. So I've got a funny feeling that in September, the episodes are going to be long because there's so much to break down in these stories. And I say that about nearly every case, that there's so much to break down. And I often sit there and go, why did you choose to do a short attention span podcast? And then I remember it's because I've got a short attention span. But I think in serial killer cases, we can appreciate a short attention span or not. It is quite difficult to compress this without giving space and time for each victim in each story. So I've done my best. Let me know God, we're stuttering. Let me know if you guys would like any changes, and we'll do our best to make them throughout. Also, I want to know what you guys are thinking of the series so far. I mean, we're this far in. Thus far, I will say the feedback from the DMs I've gotten on TikTok and in email, some of you guys love email. I love that. I really do love that. And Instagram. Can I think right now? No, because it's currently 10:51 p.m. and I can't think. Yeah, give me some feedback. Give me some series ideas. What do you guys want to hear? I've been trying quite intensely to fulfill the requests that we've been getting. So let me know. Let me know what you guys are thinking. What cases are tugging at your mind? I have one that keeps getting requested that I am going to cover, but I think it's going to be my first two-parter. And I'm not going to talk too soon because I haven't done the back end work or the scripting or anything for it yet. So we won't talk too soon, and I'm not going to tell you guys the case too soon. But I've gotten 5 requests for it now. So I think I'm at the peaking point where that will be coming. And I dare say it'll be a Monday Madness one. Yep. And I reckon some of you guys are going to guess it. If you can guess it, yes, we might play a game. Can you guys guess what my most requested case is? So this is us closing in on our first episode of Serial Killer September. Now, I want you to sit with this episode, or don't sit with it, run from it, whatever feels comfortable for you. But take this as a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask. And evil doesn't always look evil. So this was the Moors murders, and I hope you guys enjoyed. So we're going to finish this off with a question. Tell me your serial killer case that rattles your mind the most. I must know what rattles others' minds. I am going to share mine next week because I feel like I have done so much research on serial killer cases lately that I don't even know what my rattler is. I'm going to call it a rattler. But that is what I'm going to leave you guys on to finish this off. And of course, I'm also going to leave you guys on our final note, which I always do. My God, before that, I almost forgot. Thank you for joining me on Chaotic Crime. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sticking with me. And now we can do our thing. Until next time, stay loud, stay curious, and never, ever, ever ignore the red flags. Trust your gut.